We hear all the time about these huge climate promises made at global summits. But have you ever wondered how those grand pledges actually turn into action on the ground? Well, today we're going to go behind the headlines and look at the machinery, the actual plumbing that connects those international handshakes to corporate balance sheets and financial markets. Okay, let's get into it.
Think about it. The Paris Agreement back in 2015 was this huge, celebrated moment, a real landmark. But the real work, that super complex, nitty-gritty process of turning a global handshake into real change, that all started way after the cameras went home. So how does that machinery actually work?
To really get a grip on where we are now, we kind of have to trace the path that got us here. The journey to our current climate framework, well, it was a long and winding road for sure. It was shaped by decades of really complicated science and, let's be honest, even more complicated negotiations.
So things really started to pick up steam in the late 80s and early 90s. First, you get the IPCC to handle the science, then the UNFCCC to handle the politics. And that led to the first big swing at cutting emissions, the Kyoto Protocol in '97. But it wasn't until 2015, with the Paris Agreement, that the world finally landed on a model that basically everyone could sign up for.
And this slide right here shows you the huge shift in thinking between those two agreements. Kyoto was very top-down, super rigid. It tried to impose legally binding targets on just a small club of rich nations, which frankly is a big reason why it mostly failed. Paris completely flipped the script. It's a bottom-up approach where every single country sets its own pledges. It basically traded the idea of legal enforcement for the very real power of getting everyone in the room and relying on peer pressure.
The core of this whole bottom-up system is something called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs for short. This is really the beating heart of the Paris Agreement. Each country just looks at its own situation, its own economy, and puts forward its own plan. These NDCs are the individual Lego bricks of the entire global effort.
So what stops a country from just submitting a really weak plan and calling it a day? This is the clever part. It's called the Ratchet mechanism. The deal is, every 5 years, countries have to come back to the table with a new, more ambitious plan. So the system isn't designed for a one-and-done fix, it's built for constant improvement, to literally ratchet global ambition higher and higher over time. Pretty smart.
Okay, so countries have made their pledges. What's next? Well, now you have to turn those promises into practice. And that brings us to the policy toolbox, the specific gadgets and levers governments pull to turn their NDCs into actual economic change.
One of the most popular tools in that box is putting a price on carbon. The most straightforward way is a carbon tax. You just pay a direct fee for every ton of CO2 you emit. It gives you price certainty, but, changing tax levels can be a political nightmare. The other main approach is cap and trade. You set a firm limit, a cap, on total emissions, and then companies can buy and sell permits to pollute.
But carbon pricing isn't the only game in town, not by a long shot. Governments use a whole bunch of other policies for specific sectors. Things like forcing utilities to get a certain chunk of their power from renewables, or guaranteeing prices for solar and wind farms to get people to build them, or setting really tough fuel efficiency standards for cars, or even offering you subsidies to help you buy an electric vehicle. It's definitely a multi-pronged attack.
All right, so we've gone from global agreements down to national policies. But who's actually doing the emitting? Let's zoom in now to the corporate world and ask a really crucial question. How do you even count this stuff?
For any of this to work, everyone has to be speaking the same language. And that language is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It's basically the global accounting standard for this stuff. It sets the rules so that when Company A reports its emissions, it means the exact same thing as when Company B does. You can think of it as the essential grammar for this entire conversation.
And the protocol breaks emissions down into 3 categories, or scopes. Scope 1 is simple. That's the smoke coming out of your factory's smokestacks, stuff you own and control. Scope 2 is the emissions from the electricity you buy. So it's the emissions from the power plant smokestacks. And then there's Scope 3, which is everything else. It's all the emissions from your entire value chain, from your suppliers all the way to your customers using your products. It's everyone else's smokestacks.
And right here, this is the great puzzle of corporate climate action. For most companies, Scope 3 is by far the biggest slice of their carbon pie, but it is incredibly difficult to measure. It's sprawling, it's complex, and the risk of accidentally counting the same emissions twice across the supply chain is massive. Getting Scope 3 right is one of the toughest challenges in this whole space.
So far, we've talked about governments and corporations, but there's a third, incredibly powerful player in all this, the financial system. So let's look at how the world of money is being totally rewired to deal with climate change.
A key tool in this rewiring is something called a green taxonomy. I know, it sounds super technical, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It's a dictionary. It's a classification system that gives an official definition of what actually counts as a green or sustainable activity. The whole point is to create clarity and fight back against corporate greenwashing.
But in the real world, these taxonomies are fiercely debated. On the one hand, yeah, they help fight greenwashing and make it easier to compare investments. But on the other hand, they can be a really blunt tool. You're either green or you're not, with no room in between. And the process for creating them can be subject to some really intense political lobbying. I mean, just look at the controversy in the EU when natural gas was labeled as a sustainable investment.
And this quote right here, it perfectly captures the biggest risk. The fear is that these labels encourage a kind of lazy investing. That instead of doing the hard work and deep analysis, big institutions will just buy the label, potentially missing some crucial details and maybe even creating investment bubbles in so-called green assets.
And it's not just about defining what's green, it's about managing risk across the entire system. Central banks, working together in groups like the Network for Greening the Financial System, are now looking at climate risk on two different levels. First is microprudential, think microscope. Regulators look at individual banks and insurers to make sure they're ready. The other is macroprudential, the big picture. They run these huge stress tests to see if a big climate shock could actually cause a system-wide financial meltdown.
Okay, finally, this isn't just about what governments and regulators are doing. The private sector itself is getting organized, creating this powerful coalition effect that is putting the accelerator on the whole transition.
And this pressure from the private sector is coming from some real heavy hitters. You've got influential investor groups like the IPCC, super targeted campaigns like Climate Action 100+, which focuses on the world's biggest emitters, and then these massive umbrella groups like Race to Net Zero and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ.
And just to give you a sense of the scale we are talking about here, GFANZ all by itself brings together over 160 financial firms that represent more than $70 trillion in assets. That is just a mind-boggling amount of financial firepower, all pointed in the same direction, getting to net zero. So when you pull back and you look at the whole picture, you can finally see what's being built here. It's a vast, interconnected architecture of pressure. It runs all the way from those global treaties we started with down to the fine print of corporate accounting rules. It's this hybrid system, powered by that top-down government policy, but increasingly driven by enormous bottom-up pressure from the financial world.
All of this machinery is being built and switched on. The plumbing is being connected, but it leaves us with the ultimate question, doesn't it? We're building the architecture, but is there enough pressure in the system, from investors, from activists, from all of us, to make it work fast enough to meet the incredible challenge we face?